So my name is Brian Pentland. Hi, everybody. This is the first time I've done one of these, so we had a little rough start. I think I may have had a calendaring issue. So anyway, I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing over the last couple of years for visualizing action patterns. And this is using software I've written that I call ThreadNet. And what I want to talk to you about is the sort of foundation, like what's the idea of it, and then give you some background on how to find it and use it if you want to. So if you wanted to actually install this, you would visit this website, routines.broad.msu.edu, and you can either get instructions for installing an R package off of GitHub that has the Shiny app, or you can download installers for a MATLAB version of the program that has some different features. So there's a couple different things that you can actually do. So this is new tools that you can use for analyzing and visualizing action patterns. So let me talk a little bit about, real quickly, give you kind of the basics about this. So when you're looking at action patterns, you need to think about the context of the action and time. These are the sort of basic ideas that I'm wrestling with. And if you think about any one action, it's just kind of sitting there by itself. And the question is how it's related to other processes, how it compares to other processes. And as you go through that, the first question you might ask is, you observe one action, but you could have observed other actions. Like there's, whoa, what happened there? Other alternatives. And the meaning of the one action that you observe comes from difference, right? You see one thing, but there could have been others. And context matters, right? So you see one particular action, but what the significance of that action depends on who did it and who else was there and where they were and what they were thinking and what they intended, and was it illegal or legal or what, and a ton of other things. All those contextual dimensions influence the interpretation of any particular action. And timing matters, or temporal context. So what happened first and what happened next? I mean, in sports, it's like, did you make it to first base before the throw? Or are you safe or are you out, right? Sequence matters tremendously in some situations, but not so much maybe in other situations. And of course, this, as it says on the slide, composition and aggregation, you have certain kinds of things that are a combination of smaller events. Like this whole presentation is a combination of a lot of little slides, right? It's an aggregate. So together, you can put these things together and say actions and events are situated along multiple dimensions. And if you're into structural linguistics, you might recognize the idea that there are the syntagmatic dimensions, right? The sequence and order, that's the vertical dimension here, and the paradigmatic dimension, which is the sort of what else could have happened in context. Right, and this is like a foundational thing. I mean, there's nothing new about this. This is just the idea of situated action. And the problem is when you're trying to analyze action patterns, you need to take into account sequential and temporal context, along with, you need to take this whole picture into account, I think, in order to understand what's going on. So, the problem, I think, is that current process analysis software tools are generally not context sensitive. The way we think about these things tends to treat actions and events like they're unitary, context-free objects, right? It takes them out of context. And so what I've tried to do is create software that helps people visualize action patterns in a more context-sensitive way. And I call this thing ThreadNet. And so just to show you that, the basic idea, the name for it comes from, ThreadNet, weaving threads into networks. So in the upper part of this slide, you'll see some example data. This is from a dermatology clinic, and you run it through the software and you get, graphs. And there's a ton of stuff like this in the software. It's very easy to use. You don't need to actually know any R code. It's all point and click because it's a Shiny R app, if you're familiar. And so metaphorically, the idea of ThreadNet is, the events in some setting that you're looking at are like beads on a thread, right? And so in earlier work, we've called them functional events. You could think of them as vertices in a graph. And any one thread is kind of messy like this, but if you put them together, you might find a lot of them that are all very similar, right? So, wow, this is a highly structured kind of thing. The beads are similar, and there they go. Or you might have a highly varied kind of setting where the beads tend to be fairly unique, right? Get the metaphor. So let's look at some examples. These are created using ThreadNet 2. This is the MATLAB version. And these are examples from the U.S. City Banking Center. This is data I collected about 20 years ago. So it has that same structure, right? So time, the vertical dimension, timestamp, and then this contextual dimension. So there's an actor, an action, some artifact or system they were using. And so anyway, you take this, feed it into ThreadNet, and you get these networks. And we could spend hours on the details of this, but let me just show you these things. So these are 170 problem-solving things. There's the graph, and here's another department. Here's another department, and here's another department. So are we catching it? Is this interesting? I don't know. You tell me. Kind of seems to me that some of these departments have a very highly structured way of doing things, like Department 4 and Department 2, whereas Department 1 and Department 3 maybe less so. But if you look closer at Department 3, you can see in the graph here certain elements that are actually they're reminiscent of the structure that you see here. This is like a task assignment thing where this is feeding those. And these are graphs of events, right? Not social networks. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Anyway, all I wanted to really say is if you can put your data in this kind of format, right, then you can use ThreadNet to help you visualize it. So ThreadNet 2, which is in MATLAB, runs on Windows or OS X. You got to download a kind of a significant little installer thing that downloads the MATLAB core functions for you. This version does not provide support for like the temporal aggregation of. It just treats it kind of as one-to-one. ThreadNet 3 is the thing I just last week got my GitHub package kind of working, so it can be installed from GitHub. And it's a Shiny R app, and it's a lot of fun to use. So anyway, so the key points out of this is visualizing process phenomena like routines should help us ask better questions. Like when you're looking at these graphs, you can say, well, why are these departments different? Like what's different there? And I think that whether it's ThreadNet or hopefully something that you can find that's better, it can help you visualize and compare processual phenomena. And that's my story. All you got to do is find the rhythm and the rhyme in the endless stream of moments as you're thrown through time. So anyhow, if you want to read more about it, you can check out these things. And I think that's my show for today. Sound good? Dead silence. Do I need to?
Hi, Brian.
Hi.
We're still waiting for Thomas. He's trying to conference in now over his phone. Usually what we do now is the participants will ask questions in the chat box.
Sure.
And then you have some time to respond to them.
So they ask in writing, and I talk the answers, or do I type?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So if anyone has any questions, do you see the chat box?
I do not yet.
Okay. So on the bottom menu, if you click and right in the middle, it says chat. Oh, so here, let me stop your. First, could you end
Stop sharing.
screen. Yeah. And then,
Now I've got it, yeah.
yeah.
Voila.
So there's a question.
Oh, look, questions. Yes. So from Lauren Locklear in
there you go.
Memphis, Tennessee. Hi, Lauren. Thanks for calling into the show today. So, yeah. So do you need to have longitudinal data? Well, if by longitudinal you mean data that occurs over time, like time-stamped data, the answer is it needs to have sequence, right? So in ThreadNet 3, the Shiny R version, it uses timestamps. And if you don't have, because time is how you indicate process, right? So I say yes to that question. Thank you for, can this be used for experience sampling data? I think so, right? Because experience sampling data, that's where people keep track of what they're doing or thinking as they move through time. And as long as it's temporally ordered, then that should be useful, right? So I'd say yes to experience sampling. Let's see. And by the way, all this kind of stuff, there's on that website, there is user documentation. You know, I created, it's brief and a little cheesy, but it answers a lot of basic questions about the format and requirements. So Anastasia is asking, so you mentioned that interesting to know different just ThreadNet light. So, okay, so ThreadNet 3 is just visualization. I did that on purpose because I wanted to get it out there and just sort of look at the possibilities. ThreadNet 2 has metrics. Like you can compute like a cosine distance, you know, one graph to another graph. I think it's a really challenging problem to compare graphs, and some of you may know more about this, but it's a sort of open-ended research issue in computational mathematics, in graph comparison. So so at this point, I think visualization is the safe way to go. See, John Paul Stevens question: how do you ascertain potential? So, all right, so the first part of this is, how do you ascertain the potential set of alternative actions to any given action? That's an ethnographic issue, essentially. In some setting, right, how is the setting structured? How do the actors perceive it? What are the choices? And it's situational, right? I think there's no, so and that points to the key issue in using a tool like this, is you need to code the data, right? And so the next part of your question, does all this follow from qualitative observations? It follows from categorical observations, right? And so that could come from qualitative data. So for example, the Citibank data was actually people doing something very much like experience sampling. They were keeping track of their work on a kind of structured event log, you know, writing down what they did. These days, a lot of automated systems keep event logs, and I wouldn't really call that a qualitative observation. You know, it's computer generated, but that fits right into this. You're asking about video data. You know, video data would need to be coded. You'd need to code, you know, scene by scene or frame by frame. You know, what you want to do. So can you analyze a large number of individuals? So the answer is sort of. What do you mean by large? So the Shiny R version, it'll easily read in tens of thousands of rows in a data set. And if each row, I mean, so for career data, I've seen examples of that where you might have like someone's in a particular job or in a particular, they make a change. So the answer is yes. But large, I mean, I don't think of ThreadNet as a big data thing. If you got more than about 50 or 60,000, I wouldn't hold my breath. It's on a laptop. I could, if I got back to showing the screen, I could show you. But if you're talking 50,000 individuals and each of them has 50 career moves or something, this is not, it's going to get bogged down.
Brian?
Yeah.
I have you, one more question. Oh, more questions came in. I thought that.
No, I think I'm caught up on the questions that are here.
Okay. So I think that Thomas, I think he dialed in. Hold on one second. Yeah. Thomas, is that you?
Yes. Do you hear me? I apologize for the mess up here, but Brian, given that you started a little bit later, if there are any more questions for you, please take the time to answer a few more questions.
Sure. Yeah. Sorry about that. I'd got the timing wrong in my head somehow.
No worries. We all had some technical difficulties here this morning. So if there are any more questions, I can dial in, but unfortunately I cannot see the chat feed. So if you have any more questions there, please take a few more minutes to respond to those.
Yeah, it looks like it's died down.
Okay. Well, if it naturally dies down, maybe at the end, if we have any more questions left and we have any time left, we can get back to those.
I do see one more question from John Paul, which is, do you first need to learn R before using ThreadNet? And the answer is no. So it's what's called a Shiny R app, and so it's all point and click. You load your data. You need to, like you're loading your data, and you point and click and stuff on the menu. Unlike tools like Treminer, you may be familiar with, where you really do need a certain level of R skills to even start. This is all point and click, and part of the reason for that was just so that there'd be a low barrier to entry. So, mind share the last page, your recommended reading. Oh, I need to then share the share the screen.
Well, you don't
actually. So actually,
slides,
right? Brian, we do have both your PowerPoint presentation and the recommended readings already in the Dropbox folder.
Oh, good. Okay.
For all participants to look at. That's already accessible to them.
Super. Good. Well, then thank you so much, everyone. I'll get out of the way and let the show go on.
Well, Brian, thank you very much. And in the interest of time, we can move on to Oleg Petrenko. Oleg, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Perfect. So Oleg will speak to us about video techniques for assessing personality traits. And Oleg, please, if you would just take your time for your presentation, and after your presentation, we'll turn to the questions that come through the chat feed.
Okay. Perfect. My name is Oleg Petrenko. I'm here at Texas Tech in the great city of Lubbock, Texas. And today I'm just going to briefly talk about the videometric approach and give kind of a brief overview of what it does, why, and I'll start with just a brief history. We started this process back when I was in doctoral program at Oklahoma State University. So a few of us there were really interested in CEOs. And we started looking specifically at how do we measure and how do we understand the effect of CEO personality on decision-making, because there is so much variance in terms of personality among CEOs. And being a doc student, I thought it was easy to do. You just send a questionnaire and hopefully they will respond. But pretty quickly I found out that there are several measurement issues. First of all, the biggest one that we faced was low response rate. So even getting in touch with them proved to be very difficult. We did some interviews, but our N was close to like 7 or 8 out of 50 requests. The second issue that we started seeing, and it's widely captured in the literature, is the idea of desirability bias. And that's basically if you ask somebody about their narcissism or about their some not so good personality aspects, maybe Machiavellianism or arrogance or things like that, the person will respond based on how they think they should respond rather than it being a truthful response. So we started looking at different options, and at that point in time, Chatterjee and Hambrick just came out with their work on narcissism and ISQ. But when we started looking at those scales, the problem was, how do you create scales for other personality traits? So for example, I was very interested in humility and extroversion, charisma, things like that. So after a while, we kind of started looking at different options, and Federico Eimich, who was ended up being my chair, he did some research that looked at children and how children play. And what we started seeing is that, with children, you face very similar issues. So for example, if you give a child a questionnaire on narcissism, a kid doesn't really understand what it is. So you cannot expect him or her to fill that out. So we started talking to people in psychology, and basically what they've been using for a while is the idea of observation. So they watch children play, and they use clinical psychologists who are trained in personality in different scales and who are conducting the research. They, after watching the child play or some kind of interactions with children, they basically take the valid scale and they fill it out, and that's how they measure children. So we thought, why couldn't we do the same with the CEOs? Because we see a lot of data being really widely available in terms of videos, and the way our economy is becoming more informal. We see more interviews, we see more graduation speeches, and a lot of different videos available of CEOs, and basically they're all available from publicly available sources. So YouTube, CNN, MSNBC, etc. So that was the original idea of using the videos and trying to use them to assess the personality of CEOs, so we have some kind of measure that we can use in creating models of how personality affects the decision making, affects the strategy of organizations. So what we did the third-party ratings, and to do that, it sounds simple, but it's actually not that simple, because you have to find very specific people who are trained in clinical psychology. So we went to our psychology department back at Oklahoma State, and we used students who were past comps, because one of the things we found out was that the personality class was actually offered like towards the second year. So a first-year student really didn't have a good understanding of different scales, of how they relate to each other, of how they differ with each other. So we solicited a few students. We did personal interviews with them, just trying to understand, to make sure that they understand what we're doing, to make sure that they're conscientious enough to do what we're asking them. Each video of the CEO was rated by 3 raters, so we ended up hiring 4 just in case. And a big thing that we also found out was you do have to provide them quite a bit of training, because the way we set it up was they could work on their own time. But one of the fears we had was that somebody would come in and just randomly go through the surveys, not watch really the videos. So in the design of this method is probably the most time consuming, because you have to put a lot of different things to make sure that there are no fatigue issues. So we actually had we used Qualtrics, but the platform doesn't really matter, but we set it up where they cannot spend more than 1 hour doing this project. We also had timestamps to make sure, and we told them that they have to take at least an hour break before they finish one part of the project and then start another part of the project. We also included a lot of attention checks to make sure they watch the whole video rather than the first 10 seconds or anything like that. And really, the first time we did that, and now we've done that a few times to collect more data, but you really have to work with your raters, monitor them to make sure that everything is on track. Of course, we collected quite a few measures. We collected the narcissism measure, humility, Big Five, I think a total of 13 measures with basically random assignment of raters to measures. And the design took a while. One big question we had initially was, how long do the videos need to be? Because, if the video needs to be an hour, then, you're talking about 150 CEOs, you multiply it by 3, you're talking about a lot of time. So we actually conducted several robustness checks. And the first one was really to understand what is the optimal length of the video. So we tested different lengths, starting with 15 seconds, 90 seconds, a minute, minute and a half, all the way to like 25 minutes. And what we saw is that initially there is a lot of variance between the ratings. There is quite low ICCs between the raters, and the ratings actually change depending on 15 seconds to 60 seconds. But after about 2.5 minutes, we actually saw the plateau effect. So the ICCs went pretty high, remained stable. The ratings didn't change based on 2.5 or 5 or 10 minutes. And we also started talking to the psychology people who do similar work. And there is it's called the thin slices theory. And basically in psychology, there is already quite a bit of evidence showing that we make pretty quick and pretty valid judgments within really very short time. In our case, again, based on our first study, we found out that 2.5 minutes is pretty much the optimal in terms of inter-rater agreement, in terms of reliability. Another thing that we also found out was that if the person understands that they're rating a CEO or somebody in a position of power, the rater's bias can start to kick in. So we started editing the videos to make sure we removed any kind of personal information about the CEO, the fact that they are the CEO. We even removed company name, because sometimes, we all have our kind of biases about different organizations. So that was a little bit tricky, because a lot of times when you see the CEO do the interview, first of all, they start with, mentioning of the company. They start with a lot of times mentioning their name. So it was really difficult, but very doable to find, those complete segments, because you don't want to cut them off, halfway during the interview, or you don't want to cut them off, mid-sentence. So to find those segments where there is no personal information, where the focus needs to be also on the CEO, because some interviews, some of the videos we saw, they would have a picture in the background and kind of show the video as the CEO talk, but based on, our understanding of, again, really communication literature, a large portion of our communication is in nonverbals, how people mimic, how they gesture. So those segments, they had to specifically focus on the CEO, where the rater could see the CEO and they can assess them. We also had some issues as far as the decent video and audio quality, but again, the first time we've done this was in 2010 or 2011. And since then, that really is not a problem anymore. We just did another study about 6 months ago, and the quality, both of the video and the audio, has increased dramatically, where you can fairly easily get access to high quality videos. So what we found, basically with this method, first of all, again, the videos of top executives are widely available. Initial study, we looked at Fortune 500 CEOs who were able to get close to 190 CEO videos. Again, that was in 2010. Today, that number has gone up quite a bit. If you go to smaller companies, that's a little bit trickier because they're just not as present in the video media. You can get some press releases, but really the video data, it still is fairly restricted to large companies. Even though right now we are doing one, using the same method, a project where we'll look at the pitches by the entrepreneurs, how they solicit money and how they pitch their projects. So we're starting to kind of push this away from just being exclusively to the CEOs. We also started looking at some of the top management teams, board potentially. So I think in the future, this is going to be easier to get access to smaller companies, to other top executives. I think the biggest benefit that we see here is that it allows us to use validated psychometric instruments. So instead of using some kind of proxy measurement, we actually able to use the NPI for narcissism, or the hexaco scales, or the the charisma, the humility scales, and that takes a big load of our back that we don't have to develop a new measure and try to validate, the proxy measure. How does it relate to the actual measure of narcissism, or charisma, or humility? So essentially, it gives us kind of the idea of a cleaner lenses. And in psychology research, again, with some things, for example, I'm doing some research on humility right now. So you cannot really measure humility with the self-report. Because think about, if you give a survey on humility to a humble individual, well, them being humble, they're going to basically lower their humility, and there is this idea of humility bias. Same thing, with narcissism or some other scales. For example, if you think about psychopathy, nobody is going to admit to that, even though there is some preliminary research showing that the CEOs are pretty high on that. So that gives us basically an unobtrusive measure where we don't have to have access to those CEOs, yet it's very direct. Again, it's a direct observation using using developed scales that have been used for years in the literature, and there is a lot of validation of those scales. Some other things that we started looking and kind of did some more robustness checks. Again, the length of the video, ICCs and means plateau about 2.5 minutes. We also looked at different videos of the same CEOs, and initially we did just a random sample, but we actually repeated this robustness check for another study, and what we see is that the ratings are very consistent. So if you take two different videos of the same CEO across different times, you see that the ratings are pretty stable, which goes along all the research in psychology that shows that the personality is stable. So there is no significant difference between videos. Another thing that we did was we looked at basically how does this compare with the self-report survey and ratings of acquaintances. So we actually enlisted some individuals and we had them basically tape a short interview with some fairly standard questions. And then we collected their self-report, and we collected also ratings by people who knew them very well. A lot of times it was their significant other, sometimes it was their close friend, and then we use videometric approach to evaluate those individuals based on those scales. And what we saw is that actually there are no significant differences between ratings. So we were able to see that, you know, in a situation where the person is self-report is to be trusted, and we have reports by somebody that knows them very well, and then we take somebody who is trained in psychology but doesn't know them and just observe them, those ratings, they converge to a point where there's no significant differences. Now, this method is fairly new to management. It has been widely used in other areas, again, namely psychology, in clinical psychology, in child developmental psychology. But for us, it's fairly new. So if you're interested to know more about it, there are a couple pieces. One is an SMJ, and one is an AMJ, just came out by Gupta and Misanji. And we also just submitted and got accepted a paper that basically, what we do there is we replicate a few papers that were published using other methods, back to the, the idea of Huber's hypothesis, Hayward and Hambrick. And it's going to be published in Research Methodology and Strategy and Management. And in that specific paper, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the design, talking about the development of the method, rather than just presenting. I think that's it. So if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to take any.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Oleg. I'm back online here, so I will help you with moderating the questions. Everyone, please bring in your questions for Oleg. So the first question here on IRB issues with CEO data, Oleg.
Okay, I'm trying to find where my questions are. As far as the RB issues, you do have to do an RB, but we didn't have any problems with RB because you're not really violating any privacy situation because all these sources are publicly available. So the RB usually focuses, and again, we've done several of them now, just to make sure that the raters, there is no undue pressure, that, the issue of compensation, things like that. We haven't got any pushback on RB whatsoever because, again, you're using publicly available data.
Mm-hmm. All right, other questions? Okay, Oleg, the question here on CEOs speaking in public.
Yes, and you're absolutely correct. Not only that, they're conscious about it, their image, they're highly trained in public speaking. So if you take a CEO of any large company, they have their own PR department where they go through, and those people are very well trained to impression management, things like that. So that is definitely a potential concern. Now, from my experience, it doesn't really matter that much because think about Donald Trump. He was a CEO, he is a president, very well trained. Can you tell the person is narcissistic? Yes. Think of any politician. Can you see their personality through that? Yes, you can. Think of Hillary Clinton, Paul Ryan, Steve Jobs, really any person in the position of power, again, with the similar consciousness and training with PR departments. Again, it is a concern, but based on my experience, it's not that big of a concern. Is it the same issue self-reported measure would have? Yes and no. Again, in a self-report, it's much easier to put a 1 of 7 where you think 1 of 7 belongs. But in a situation of real-time interview, and again, most of the videos come from the interviews, they're not pre-recorded PR, pre-recorded press releases from a company website, I think the concern is much less than with the self-report. But again, of course, they are very intelligent, very well trained in terms of that. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, everybody, we have time for a few more questions here. So please send them in for Oleg. So Oleg, well, actually, there's a question here.
Yes.
Have there things that were captured beyond personality traits, such as behavior or cognition? If you could speak to that.
Behavior and cognition, I don't know, because, to measure behavior with the video, it really would require a much, more videos, longer period of time. And I don't know if the video would be the best to measure the behavior. As far as the cognition, that's also a difficult question, because one of the problems, and thank you for this question actually, one of the problems we found was that some scales are not very well suited for this method. And one that comes to mind, which was a big disappointment to me personally, it was the idea of conscientiousness. So when we tried using this approach to measure conscientiousness, we saw that our reliability is low and our ICCs are very low. And the reason that we think is there is that idea that, conscientiousness is really about the cognition. It's more about also behaviors. And it's very difficult to capture that in a short video. It requires a larger knowledge of a person's past behavior, of how they think, what is important to them, compared to, again, a scale such as humility or narcissism that is very well suited for this type of method. So I think cognition could be a problem here. So you probably could do cognition with larger interviews that are somewhat context specific, but I would think, that you would have to put some more effort and thinking into that. Other reference in psychology, I actually do have a paper here. I didn't put it on the slide, but there is a paper. We're doing some research on psychopathy right now, and there is a paper in psychological assessment detecting psychology from thin slices of behavior. It's by Fowler and Patrick. I don't know if you can see it, but I can add it to the slides.
Or you could also just type the reference into the chat room, Oleg.
Yes.
After we're done with the questions, then everybody can get it from there as well.
So Fowler and Patrick, and it's a 2009 piece. And if you look at both the SMJ and that research methods piece that are cited in the slides, there is quite a bit of discussion as far as psychology and third-party observations there. So you can go there as well. Now, the other question that I haven't answered, have you done some longitudinal studies with the videos? I imagine some personality may vary over time depending on the situation. That's a good question. And we have done, basically what we've done, we took different videos of different CEOs across different times. So we've done just, 2 periods in time with 3 year between them. What we see is that, personality is pretty stable. And that, again, goes along with most of the research on personality that shows your personality changes quite a bit, but from psychology, what they see is close to 24 to 27 years old, your personality kind of gets to the true point. And after that, your personality is very stable across time. Again, between up to 27, 24 years, your personality still, it's more of a developmental process, but once it's established, and by the time you're 30, your personality doesn't really change unless there is some kind of traumatic effect. So to answer your question, you can do longitudinal studies with that. And again, we've done different videos at different times, but in most of our modeling, we do assume personality is stable, which makes it, I wouldn't call it tricky, but you cannot use, because of that, for example, fixed effect estimation. So you're looking more at GE estimation or other modeling that allows you to get the effect of time invariant variable.
Oleg, perhaps the last question we can take here is the question on psychological factors, video metrics versus experiment.
Well, in my view of the world, there is nothing better than an experiment. I think experiments would be the golden standard, and they are. The problem is, you know, when you're dealing with CEOs or top executives or board members, there is really no way to do an experiment. It's outside of realm of possibility. So I don't think I can say that video metrics is better than experiment. The answer is absolutely not. Experiment would be better. The problem is I don't see how it's feasible to do any kind of experiments with this population. I'd love to do that personally, but in that sense, I think video metrics is much more feasible than experimental design.
I think that was an excellent answer. When we are in the realm of research methods, there's what is better, and then what is appropriate and feasible given the resources we have available.
Yes.
So I think in the interest of time, we are moving on to our last presenter now. Oleg, thank you very much for the presentation, and thank you very much for the questions, answering the questions, and maybe we have some time at the end to take any additional questions if there's some time. And then a welcome to Jim Dieffendorff from the University of Akron, who will speak to us now about the issue.
All right, can you hear me? Okay, I think that you can hear me. If for some reason you can't, someone message me, but my sound went out whenever I opened this up. So we'll get started. So thank you, Thomas, for organizing this and inviting all of us to this session. It's been fascinating from my perspective. What I want to do today is talk with you a little bit about a technique that I've been using over the past several years, something called continuous rating assessment. And as the title suggests, I think it's primarily relevant to capturing and measuring issues regarding time. And so in thinking about time and OBHR theory, as we all know, time is an integral part of human experience. Our consciousness is ordered temporally. And so if you think about, some event occurs that then leads to an emotional reaction, which leads to cognitions, which leads to then subsequent behavior, that inherently has a flow of time as part of it. And, even thinking about most of our organizational theories, they implicitly have time built into them as well. So picture a causal model with an independent variable, a mediator, and a dependent variable. That suggests a causal flow. The issue is that most of our data over the past many years of doing research in organizational sciences rarely gets at this longitudinal aspect of it. And this is not a new complaint. I mean, you look at the sites here, Mitchell and James and George and Jones are almost 20 years old. But we still see that for a lot of the research questions, we're taking more of static kind of measurements. Now, a trend you do see is that a lot of research is trying to separate measures in time, maybe collecting an independent variable at time 1, mediator at time 2, dependent variable at time 3, but that really doesn't get at the dynamics. It really doesn't reflect the nature of change. And so what we need is truly longitudinal designs. And so the current sort of best practices here in terms of capturing things longitudinally may be things like a daily diary type of assessment, or maybe experience sampling. With daily diary, oftentimes asking folks to reflect on a period of time and to rate how they felt over that period of time, whether it be think about how your affect for today, think about your affect during your last customer interaction, or experience sampling methodology, which gets even more precise in that you ask people to think about maybe how they feel right now and to report on that many times over the course of a day. The problem with these two approaches, though, is that they're really giving us just kind of snapshots about what's going on in terms of some psychological experience. And they really they can reflect change, but the timing of the measurement becomes critical, because if we take our experience sampled assessments, for instance, too soon, then the change that we're predicting may not be fully realized. It may not have even started. If we are too late in our assessment, the change may be over, it may be completed, and maybe we return to baseline. Or worse yet, maybe we are experiencing something in the intervening time period that we weren't even aware of that led to the level of the variable that we're currently observing. So timing is critical, and it'd be great if we had theories that really specified exactly when things change and how they change, but for the most part, our theories just aren't there. And so a potential way to approach this problem is to adopt a measurement approach that doesn't have gaps, that doesn't present missing parts in our data stream. And then we can analyze that to really try to understand the nature of changes. And so the technique that we've been using is something called a continuous rating assessment technique, which involves having people either during an initial experience or a replayed experience, they'll continuously rate some psychological phenomenon over the entire course of the episode. And this can involve using a rating dial, perhaps, where they range from on a bipolar scale from one extreme to the other, or a slider. And so the idea is that whenever people are experiencing a change in some psychological process, they'll simply move the dial or the slider to reflect that change. So instead of sampling a construct as we would with experience sampling, or asking people to mentally aggregate constructs as we do with daily diaries, continuous rating assessment can allow us to fully capture constructs over the course of an entire episode. So what can this provide that other techniques cannot? Well, one thing is that it can really help us understand how constructs naturally vary in the absence of some kind of stimuli. So what kind of cycles or trends are just naturally apparent in a particular construct over some episode. Perhaps more interesting is we can look at how variables change in response to either static or dynamic stimuli. So it could be presentation of some image, or watching a video, or interacting with another person. And so we can look to see when some stimulus changes, what is the onset of the change in terms of some psychological variable? Is it a lag, is there a delay, or is it an immediate change? The rate of change in response to that stimuli. Is it slow or fast over the course of the change period? The abruptness of the change, whether it's linear or whether it perhaps is nonlinear, such that it is accelerating or decelerating. And then when the change happens, is it permanent? Does it stay at a new level? Or does it return to baseline, as a lot of homeostatic systems would? So you can also, if you have multiple continuously measured variables, you can see how those dynamic variables relate to each other over the course of an episode. So just a couple examples to show you what this might look like. One example comes from the work of Iris Mauss, looking at the coherence of emotion, behavior, and physiological responding. And basically what she did was have folks watch a video, and then they continuously rated how they felt during the course of the video, as well as collected data on the facial behavior in terms of the emotional expressions that they had, and then their physiological responding. So here's an image from the amusement experience that people provided. And so you can see over the course of the video, there are funny parts and then there are sort of dry parts. And you know, the way this would have been captured in prior experimental work would have been to have people at the end of the video simply rate how amusing was the video. And there would have been one response that would have reflected maybe the mean of these responses, but it would have missed all of this within episode variability. And then looking at the amusement behavior, again, this is trained coders watching the facial expressions of participants. You can see that that also exhibits a lot of within-person variability. And it really kind of corresponds to the emotional experience of individuals. And then you can also see through looking at some physiological assessments that, you know, while there isn't as close of a correspondence between the amusement experience and these physiological responses, there is some correspondence. And in fact, she uses something called a cross-correlation, which I'll talk about more in a little while, to show that there is indeed a positive, significant relationship between all of these different channels of emotional responding. Another example from the literature is provided by Reed et al. They looked at emotional dynamics and body weight in romantic couples. And so what they did was have romantic couples get together and talk about lifestyle choices. And these romantic couples differed in different body weight combinations. So in one instance, the couples were both healthy weight. Another instance, they were both overweight. And in other instances, one was healthy and the other was overweight. Conversations were recorded and both partners watched the videotape and rated how they felt over the course of the entire interaction. And so what they were looking for were two things. One, they wanted to know whether or not couples converged in their affective experience over the course of this episode, and then whether or not the emotions dampened over the course of it or whether they increased over the course of the episode. And so the dampening would reflect co-regulation, so down-regulating and dampening the emotion. And the increase would reflect sort of co-dysregulation, meaning things are spiraling out of control affectively. And so when both partners were healthy weight, you see that there's a relatively quick synchronization as well as fast dampening of the emotional state. It just isn't that big of a problem to talk about health-related issues when both are healthy weight. When the man is overweight and the woman is not, you see that there is more emotions occurring. It's oscillating over the course of the episode, but there is the synchronization and there is a dampening process over the course of the conversation. In contrast, when the woman is overweight and the man is not, or when both are overweight, you still see the synchronization over the course of it. So they tend to get in line emotionally over the course of the episode, but you see this co-dysregulation occurring. It becomes more and more emotional over the course of the episode, and they're not regulating their emotions in an adaptive way. And so without really getting into the implications of what that means for romantic couples, I think it's sort of interesting to think about trying to apply this to organizational context. So imagine a supervisor and an employee having a performance review meeting, and maybe they differ in their level of LMX. Or imagine a negotiation scenario where they're maybe in a competitive versus a cooperative kind of a relationship, and looking to see how these things might vacillate, whether there's convergence, whether there's the dampening or increase in emotional responding. Final example comes from stuff in my own lab with Oleg Gabriel a few years ago. We looked at applying this technique to the area of emotional labor, which is managing emotions as part of the work role. And we had a call center simulation that we designed where we had Confederates playing the role of a rude customer who said uncivil comments at specific points during the interactions. We recorded the calls and played them back for participants who then made continuous readings of their affect, their surface acting, as well as their deep acting. Surface acting being emotion regulation, in which they try to change the appearance. Deep acting is emotion regulation when you try to change how you feel. We also then collected continuous ratings of participants' vocal tone from independent evaluators who were looking for changes in affective tone. So this is just the plot of emotions over the course of the episode. And so again, typically what you would see in emotional labor research is they would collect after the episode is over, how did you feel? And that would be the end of it. But we see here that there's a great deal of within-person variability over the course of the episode in emotional responding. And these drops that you see in particular really corresponded to particular uncivil comments delivered by the customers. And then you see almost a mirror effect here of emotion regulation, in this case in surface acting, also deep acting. When there's a drop in affective experiences during an episode, you see a corresponding increase in attempts to regulate. And interestingly, if you look at the emotional expression as evaluated by the trained coders, you see that that actually stays fairly stable over the course of the episode, that people are maintaining a pretty steady external demeanor despite all this internal turmoil in terms of how they felt and in terms of their efforts aimed at regulating their emotions. So in terms of implementing this technique, there are a lot of different considerations here. We have an ORM piece from 2017 that outlines sort of these things in more detail, so I encourage you to take a look at that. The one question that you want to have is what kind of constructs are suitable for this? And I think they need to be clear, relatively simple, because basically you're having a single item type assessment. It can't be something that is much more complex. I don't think that that would work especially well. So limits it to that. I also think you need to make a choice about whether you're going to use this in a concurrent way whenever people are experiencing a stimuli for the very first time, such as watching a new video, or retrospective, meaning that it maybe occurs after some event and you record the event and then they watch this stimulus played back to them. This probably works better if the individual is a participant in the event, because they can't rate while they're being a participant necessarily. So using this sort of cued recall approach works well. And Mauss et al. Found that these two approaches actually produce fairly similar results. And then the other question is who's going to perform the ratings? I think we've used it in self-report as well as trained evaluators, and that's been done in other research in this area. But you might also think about supervisors, coworkers, customers, et cetera, as being potentially valuable sources of information in terms of conducting these ratings. Analysis consideration, there's a lot of data here, obviously, and it's intensively longitudinal. And so there's a lot of different options for analyzing it. One question that you might have is, how does a single variable change during the course of an episode? And so you can look at things just in terms of how they increase or decrease over the course of the episode, which can be analyzed using something like growth curve modeling. You can look at how things cycle over the course of an episode, whether there's natural fluctuations up and down using something like an oscillator model. And you can also look at whether there are changes in response to particular stimuli that are presented. It's sort of like what we did in the Gabriel and Dieffendorff using discontinuous growth curve modeling. And then there's also the potential to look at how continuously measured variables relate to each other over time. This is what Mauss did in their study using cross-correlation, which basically allows you to look at the covariances between continuous variables, accounting for both leads and lags of those variables over the course of an episode. And then you can also look to see how maybe a variable X might relate to changes in another variable using something like a multi-level cross-lag path analysis, which is also a technique that we used in the Gabriel and Dieffendorff. And then finally, another technique would be to use something like the coupled linear oscillator models, which are useful for trying to understand whether or not variables will converge in cycles over the course of an episode, and whether there might be amplification or de-amplification of the cycles that are observed. So in conclusion, for us, I think this is just another tool that could potentially be used to look at micro OBHR research questions. The construct measurement oftentimes isn't up to the task that our theories present to us. So we talk about really micro level dynamic within episode processes, but we don't measure things that way. And I think that this continuous rating assessment approach might be a way to provide an uninterrupted stream of data so we can understand how, when, why, and to what extent variables change over a relatively short period of time. Thanks. All right.
Thomas, your audio is not working properly. You sound like a cartoon character.
Okay, so can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can
okay,
hear
great.
you fine.
So I see there's a question from Mercedes. I think this is interesting. Wouldn't the disruption of needing to continuously assess themselves create other emotional experiences that wouldn't have otherwise occurred? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a potential issue. The only evidence we have as to whether or not this is going to bias things substantially or not comes from the work of Iris Mauss, where she had people do this using both concurrent experiences as well as recalled experiences. And she actually found that the cross-correlation of these two continuous streams of data was fairly high, and it led her to conclude that that they're getting at approximately the same information. But you're right. I mean, as with any kind of self-assessment, I think it can introduce the fact that you're measuring something can change the phenomenon that you're measuring, and I think that's potentially an issue here. And it's certainly, you know, this is a new technique, and so that would be an important question to address when using it: is the construct validity, and is it subjected to many of the same biases that other assessments are. Well, there are a variety of options for capturing your continuous data. We actually developed a E-prime version of this where we could use a mouse to move sort of a virtual slider that enables us to capture this at 5 times a second over the course of, you know, however long the interaction is. Our interactions were about 4 minutes or so on average. But there are other options. You know, I know that we also have a BioPack system that synchronizes with physiological assessment, and I have a physical slider that the BioPack MP150 system will capture that data for you as well.
Okay, we have time for a few more questions. Any more questions?
So what's the average length of an episode? In our data, they were approximately 3 to 4 minutes, but I know some of the original work using this technique was by Levinson and Gottman back in the 1980s, looking at marital interactions. And those interactions, I think, were approximately 20 to 30 minutes long. So, you know, you do get into a sort of a fatigue issue in terms of having people do this. So that's definitely a concern, but that I think is, you know, I'd say 20 to 30 minutes would probably be a reasonable period of time.
Okay, any more questions for Jim Dieffendorff here?
So there's one from Rebecca, says, how would you approach using CRAs outside a laboratory in a field setting? We are actually moving this to a call center context where we're going to get actual calls and have people, call center workers, provide self-assessments of how they felt after the calls are completed. So we're going to go to their site with a computer and be able to collect this continuous rating data from them directly. I also think, you know, looking at what Oleg presented earlier with regard to the videos of leaders, I think you could potentially get archival videos and have trained coders evaluate the leaders on various dimensions. Perhaps it's personality, perhaps it's something like leadership ability, so that you could get really a dynamic measure of leadership perceptions.
Okay, I think we can give everybody here a minute. We have a few minutes left to see if there are more questions coming in. Maybe we have a question.
So the next question is particularly suitable for capture state variables like emotions. Yeah, I think if you want to make sure, as with most measures, that your assessment matches the theoretical process. And I think, you know, we're talking about stuff that is going to fluctuate dynamically within the course of an event. So affect is a great example. Some would argue that we always are in an affective state. So it makes good sense to capture something like affect. I think you could also look at things like motivational states, or maybe the perception of some sort of process, like leadership perceptions would be an example, or maybe the fairness of how some event evolved over time, maybe how efficacious someone felt over the course of an event, their sense of competence or self-efficacy. But yeah, it is going to be more state-like phenomenon that are, according to theory, going to fluctuate during an episode. Yeah, I agree. I think it would be great to scale this to a larger number of participants over a longer period of time. You know, one of the things we're also doing here in the lab is trying to extend this to more of a team kind of context, where we're going to have teams of 3 perform a team-based task, videotape this, and then have the team members provide some sort of continuous rating assessment of their affective state over the course of the team interaction. You know, the other issue is extending over longer periods of time. You know, again, I think you kind of run into maybe a ceiling effect in terms of fatigue that people might experience. But, you know, it's worth looking into what exactly, you know, maybe you can break it up and have longer episodes be evaluated, giving folks a break in between.
Any last questions coming here?
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
There was a natural tapering off of questions. Thank you again very much, Jim Dieffendorff. And thank you very much also to our 2 other presenters. A great panel here today with Brian Pentland, Oleg Petrenko, and Jim Dieffendorff. Please feel free to use the chat function here to reach out to them to conclude this session. And I do apologize for the technical difficulties we had here, but I at the same time want to both appreciate the patience here of the panelists, and they're working with the situation, and also behind the scenes here, as usual, thanking Jesse Jensen from Karma to help us cope with this situation. And we look forward to seeing you again next week at the usual time for our 4th session. So thank you again, and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.